Good morning. I want to begin by thanking those who have gathered here today, whether in this chamber, in academic institutions, in financial ministries around the world, or among the broader public who are watching these developments with understandable concern. What I intend to address today is not a matter of political opinion, nor is it a question of national pride or diplomatic posturing. What I intend to address today is a matter of economic architecture, the foundational structure upon which decades of American prosperity, global trade stability, and multilateral financial cooperation have been carefully and deliberately built. And I must say, with the calm clarity that this moment demands, that structure is under significant and measurable stress. The title of today's address references something that has been unfolding in real time across G7 summits, bilateral trade negotiations, and international financial forums. Prime Minister Mark Carney, an economist of considerable standing, a former central banker who led both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England through periods of acute financial turbulence, has done something that many assumed would be politically impossible. He has methodically, publicly, and with the full weight of economic evidence behind him, exposed the internal contradictions and long-term vulnerabilities embedded within the tariff strategy pursued by the current American administration. This is not a personal attack. This is not diplomatic theater. This is what happens when trade policy is built on political calculus rather than economic principle. Eventually, someone with the credentials, the data, and the institutional credibility stands at a podium and simply tells the truth. Let me be precise about what we mean when we talk about tariff strategy, because precision matters enormously in this conversation. A tariff, at its most fundamental level, is a tax. It is a tax levied on imported goods, paid not by the foreign producer, as is so frequently and so incorrectly stated in public discourse, but by the domestic importer and ultimately by the domestic consumer. When the United States places a 25% tariff on Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, Canadian lumber, or Canadian agricultural products, it is American manufacturers, American construction firms, American grocery chains, and American families who absorb that cost. The foreign exporter adjusts. They find new markets. They restructure supply chains. They negotiate alternative arrangements. But the American consumer does not have that flexibility. They pay the price at the register, at the dealership, at the hardware store, and in their monthly household budget. This is not a theoretical observation. This is documented, measurable, and consistent with every serious economic analysis conducted over the past several years. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the International Monetary Fund, and a broad consensus of independent academic economists have all arrived at the same conclusion. Broad-based tariff escalation of the kind we have witnessed between the United States and Canada does not rebuild domestic manufacturing at the pace or scale promised. It does not reduce trade deficits in any structurally meaningful way, and it does not strengthen the long-term competitive position of American industry. What it does do, consistently, measurably, and with a lag of approximately 6 to 18 months depending on the sector, is raise input costs, suppress business investment, reduce real household purchasing power, and introduce the kind of policy uncertainty that causes capital to sit idle rather than flow into productive enterprise. Prime Minister Carney understands this. He understands it not because he is hostile to the United States. Canada and the United States share the longest peaceful border in the world, the deepest bilateral trade relationship in the history of modern commerce, and a security alliance that has been foundational to Western stability for nearly 8 decades. He understands it because he has spent his career studying exactly these dynamics. He served as governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 global financial crisis, guiding that institution through one of the most complex monetary policy environments of the modern era. He then served as governor of the Bank of England during the Brexit transition, arguably the most disruptive voluntary economic restructuring undertaken by a major economy in the post-war period. He has seen firsthand what happens when trade relationships are disrupted by political decision-making that is disconnected from economic reality. He has managed the consequences. He has advised governments. He has sat across the table from finance ministers, central bank governors, and heads of state and delivered difficult truths with exactitude and composure. So when Mark Carney stands before a G7 audience, or addresses the Canadian Parliament, or speaks in bilateral negotiations with American counterparts, and says that the current tariff strategy pursued by Washington is not achieving its stated objectives and is in fact producing measurable harm to both economies, that is not a political statement. That is an economic diagnosis delivered by someone with the clinical training and institutional experience to make it credibly. And the data supports him. Canadian retaliatory tariffs have been precisely calibrated to maximize political pressure on key American congressional districts while minimizing broader macroeconomic disruption to the Canadian economy itself. That is not an accident. That is strategy. Sophisticated, evidence-based, economically literate strategy. Now, I want to address the phrase that appears in today's title, the suggestion that American trade power is crumbling. I would not use that language myself. I prefer precision over provocation. But I would say this: the credibility of American trade leadership, the soft power that comes from being seen as a reliable, rules-based, institutionally committed trading partner, has been materially and measurably weakened over the past several years. And the mechanisms by which that credibility is weakened are subtle but profound. They operate not through dramatic singular events, but through the slow accumulation of broken commitments, renegotiated agreements, unilateral actions, and the gradual perception among allies and trading partners that the United States is no longer a predictable anchor of the global trading system. This matters for reasons that extend far beyond bilateral trade balances. The United States dollar serves as the world's primary reserve currency. American Treasury securities are the benchmark safe asset of the global financial system. American financial institutions intermediate a disproportionate share of global capital flows. All of these advantages, and they are enormous advantages, worth trillions of dollars in economic benefit to the American economy over decades, rest on a foundation of institutional credibility, predictability, and the perception that the United States operates within and upholds a rules-based international order. When that perception erodes, the consequences are not immediate and dramatic. They are gradual and structural, but they are real, and they compound over time. What Prime Minister Carney has done, whether intentionally or as a natural consequence of his economic literacy and his institutional positioning, is hold a mirror up to that erosion. By refusing to capitulate to tariff pressure, by retaliating with precision and proportionality, by building alternative trade relationships and deepening ties with European partners and Indo-Pacific economies, Canada has demonstrated that the leverage the United States assumed it held in this relationship was not as absolute as the tariff strategy presumed. That is a significant revelation, not because Canada is an adversary. It is not, but because if a close ally with deep economic integration and shared security interests can successfully resist and redirect American trade pressure, what does that say about the broader effectiveness of tariff-based coercion as a tool of American foreign economic policy? That is the question I want us to sit with as we move through this analysis. It is a serious question. It deserves a serious answer, and I intend to provide one grounded in data, historical precedent, and a clear-eyed assessment of where American trade strategy must evolve if it is to serve the long-term economic interests of the American people. We will examine the structural weaknesses in the tariff approach, the macroeconomic consequences that are now becoming visible in the data, the strategic realignment underway among American trading partners, and the path forward that I believe is both economically sound and politically achievable. Because the goal, always the goal, is not to win an argument. The goal is to build an economy that works for American workers, American families, and the global economic system upon which American prosperity ultimately depends. We begin that examination now. To understand the full scope of what is now unfolding in the Canada-United States trade relationship and to appreciate why the strategy being pursued by Prime Minister Carney represents such a significant challenge to the assumptions embedded in Washington's tariff approach, we must first examine the architecture of that trade relationship in considerable detail. Because one of the most consequential errors in the public discourse surrounding these tariffs, an error that has been repeated with remarkable consistency across political commentary, social media, and even some corners of mainstream economic reporting, is the assumption that Canada is a dependent economy, a junior partner, a nation whose economic fortunes are so thoroughly intertwined with American demand that it has no meaningful leverage and no viable alternative. That assumption is incorrect. And the degree to which it is incorrect has direct and measurable implications for the effectiveness of the tariff strategy it was used to justify. Let me begin with the basic dimensions of the bilateral trade relationship, because the numbers themselves tell a story that is frequently obscured by political rhetoric. The United States and Canada conduct approximately $800 billion in bilateral trade annually. Canada is, by virtually every metric, the single most important trading partner of the United States. More American states list Canada as their top export destination than list any other country in the world. The automotive supply chains that run through Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Ontario are so deeply integrated, with components crossing the border multiple times during the production process before a finished vehicle emerges, that a tariff applied at the border does not function as a clean tax on a foreign product. It functions as a friction cost applied repeatedly to a joint production system that both economies have spent decades optimizing. The steel that goes into American infrastructure projects, the aluminum that goes into American aerospace and automotive manufacturing, the softwood lumber that goes into American housing construction, the agricultural products that move in both directions across that border, these are not simply imports and exports in the traditional sense. They are components of an integrated continental economy that was deliberately and carefully structured under decades of bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement of 1988 subsequently expanded into the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994 and modernized into the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement in 2020 was not designed to benefit Canada at America's expense. It was designed, and I say this as someone who has spent decades studying the economic literature on regional trade integration, to optimize the continental production system, to allow each economy to specialize in areas of comparative advantage, to reduce transaction costs across borders, and ultimately to raise living standards and productivity across all three signatory nations. The economic evidence on NAFTA's effects, when examined dispassionately and in its entirety rather than selectively, is broadly consistent with those objectives having been achieved. Trade volumes increased substantially. Productivity in integrated sectors improved. Consumer prices for a wide range of goods declined. And the North American manufacturing base, while it underwent significant structural transformation, emerged more competitive in global markets than it would have been in the absence of integration. When tariffs are applied unilaterally to a trading partner within this kind of deeply integrated system, the economic consequences are categorically different from what tariffs do when applied in a more arm's-length trade relationship. In a conventional trade relationship, say between the United States and a country with which it has limited supply chain integration, a tariff raises the price of the imported good, potentially stimulates domestic production as a substitute, and over time may shift market share from the foreign producer to domestic competitors. The adjustment is costly and imperfect, but the basic mechanism functions more or less as described in introductory trade economics. In a deeply integrated system like the Canada-United States relationship, the mechanism breaks down in important ways. The domestic producer who was supposed to benefit from the tariff often discovers that their own production costs have risen because the inputs they source from across the border are now more expensive. The consumer who was supposed to benefit from a revitalized domestic industry discovers instead that prices have risen across the board. And the foreign trading partner, rather than being disciplined into concessions, discovers that the tariff pressure is creating an incentive to accelerate diversification away from dependence on the American market, which is precisely the outcome the tariff strategy was presumably designed to prevent. This is exactly what we have observed in the Canadian response to American tariffs. Prime Minister Carney and his government have pursued a strategy that I would characterize as structured resilience, a deliberate multi-track approach to reducing Canadian economic vulnerability to American trade policy, while simultaneously maintaining enough bilateral engagement to preserve the option of a negotiated resolution. On one track, Canada has imposed precisely calibrated retaliatory tariffs on American goods, targeting sectors and geographies that create maximum political discomfort for the American administration, while minimizing broader macroeconomic spillover within Canada. American orange juice from Florida, American bourbon from Kentucky, American motorcycles from Wisconsin. These are not random selections. They are chosen with surgical precision to apply pressure in politically sensitive constituencies, to create domestic political costs for the tariff policy within the United States itself, and to demonstrate that Canada has the analytical capacity and the political will to respond in kind. On a second track, Canada has accelerated its engagement with alternative trading partners. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and the European Union, which entered into provisional application in 2017 and has been progressively implemented since, has provided Canada with significantly expanded market access to a trading bloc of 450 million consumers with high purchasing power and sophisticated demand for the kinds of goods and services Canada produces. Canadian exports to the European Union have grown meaningfully since CETA's implementation, and the current trade tensions with the United States have provided additional impetus for Canadian businesses to invest in the relationships, logistics infrastructure, and regulatory compliance capabilities needed to serve European markets at scale. Similarly, Canada's participation in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership after the United States withdrew, has provided access to a network of Indo-Pacific economies that represents an increasingly important share of global demand growth. On a third track, and this is perhaps the most consequential development from a long-term strategic perspective, Canada has begun a serious national conversation about the structure of its own domestic economy and the degree to which certain sectors have been allowed to become excessively dependent on American market access. This conversation is taking place in boardrooms, in provincial legislatures, in university economics departments, and in federal policy working groups. It is producing concrete policy proposals, investments in port infrastructure on both coasts to facilitate non-American trade routes, regulatory reforms to accelerate the development of Canadian value-added industries in critical minerals and clean energy, strategic investments in domestic defense production capacity, and a renewed emphasis on interprovincial trade liberalization to strengthen the internal Canadian market as a buffer against external shocks. These are not emergency measures born of panic. They are strategic investments born of a clear-eyed recognition that the trade relationship with the United States, while enormously valuable, carries risks that prudent economic management requires hedging against. Now, I want to turn to what all of this means for the effectiveness of the American tariff strategy, because this is where the data becomes particularly instructive. The stated objectives of the tariff approach, as articulated by its proponents, were broadly threefold. First, to reduce the bilateral trade deficit with Canada by increasing the relative price of Canadian goods and stimulating domestic American production of substitutes. Second, to use tariff pressure as leverage to extract concessions on issues ranging from Canadian dairy supply management to digital services taxation to defense spending commitments. And third, to demonstrate American economic resolve and signal to other trading partners that the United States was willing to use its market power aggressively in defense of its economic interests. On the first objective, reducing the trade deficit, the evidence is unambiguous and consistent with what economic theory would predict. Bilateral tariffs do not reduce trade deficits in any structurally meaningful way because trade deficits are fundamentally a macroeconomic phenomenon driven by the difference between national saving and national investment, not by the specific tariff structure applied to specific bilateral trade relationships. When the United States runs a current account deficit, it is because Americans as a whole are spending more than they are producing and saving. And that gap must be financed by net capital inflows from abroad, which by accounting identity requires a corresponding current account deficit. Tariffs that reduce imports from Canada do not change this fundamental macroeconomic reality. They simply redirect the deficit toward other trading partners. And indeed, that is precisely what the data has shown. American imports from Canada have been partially substituted by imports from other countries, often at higher cost, with no meaningful reduction in the overall current account deficit. On the second objective, extracting concessions through leverage, the results have been mixed at best and counterproductive at worst. Canada has made some adjustments in areas of bilateral friction, but the overall posture of the Carney government has been one of principled resistance rather than accommodation. And crucially, the concessions that have been extracted have come at the cost of significant damage to the broader relationship, damage that will have long-term implications for the ease and depth of future bilateral cooperation across a range of issues that extend well beyond trade. On the third objective, signaling American resolve to other trading partners, the outcome has been, I would argue, the opposite of what was intended. Rather than demonstrating American economic power and deterring other nations from challenging American trade interests, the tariff conflict with Canada has demonstrated the limits of that power when applied against a sophisticated, economically literate adversary with the institutional capacity to respond strategically. Other trading partners have observed this dynamic carefully. The lesson they are drawing is not that the United States is a formidable trade adversary to be accommodated. The lesson they are drawing is that the United States is a trade partner whose reliability can no longer be assumed and whose market access can no longer be treated as a permanent and unconditional feature of the global economic landscape. That is a profoundly consequential shift in perception, and it is one that will shape trade diplomacy, investment decisions, and currency reserve allocations for years to come. This brings me to the deeper structural question that Prime Minister Carney's strategy has forced onto the international economic agenda. What is the actual source of American trade power in the modern global economy, and how durable is it in the face of sustained challenge? This is not a comfortable question for American policymakers to sit with, but it is an essential one, and I intend to address it with the directness and precision that the moment requires. American trade power has historically rested on three pillars. The first is market size. The United States is the world's largest consumer market, and access to American consumers is enormously valuable to exporters around the world. The second is financial centrality. The dollar's reserve currency status and the depth of American capital markets mean that global trade is disproportionately financed, denominated, and settled in American financial infrastructure. And the third is institutional leadership. The United States has historically been the primary architect and guardian of the rules-based international trading system, and its commitment to that system has provided the stability and predictability that global trade requires to function efficiently. The tariff strategy has not meaningfully strengthened any of these three pillars. It has, in various ways and to varying degrees, created stress on all three. Market size remains, but the willingness of trading partners to organize their economic strategies around American market access is declining as alternatives develop and as the costs of dependence become more visible. Financial centrality persists, but the incentive for trading partners to develop alternative payment systems, alternative reserve assets, and alternative financial infrastructure has increased in direct proportion to the perceived willingness of the United States to weaponize its financial centrality for coercive purposes. And institutional leadership has been substantially and visibly diminished by the pattern of unilateral action, agreement withdrawal, and rules-based norm violation that has characterized American trade policy in recent years.